we supposed to giggle in the solo?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, you guys seem to really like that last extra video that we made. I mean, 30 views in a week, you know? That's really a lot. I mean, at least a lot in terms of where this channel is, which, let's be real here, audience, this is a very, 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 very underground channel, at least right now. I mean, we're not a big name like the real top prime people up there in YouTube land, but you know, 30, at least close to 30 views on a video in a week, that's made it probably the most viewed video I've had, like, or at least the fastest viewing. I know what the most viewed is, but I cannot really work with that at all. Watch this movie to tell you why I cannot. But as some of you know, that last video I made had to have only skimmed the surface, because clearly with someone as heavily involved in this remaking Beatles after the 60s process, there's a lot of in-depth analysis that went into that. I mean, that video was the product of at least 6 years of re-going through all the different albums, retooling albums, remaking albums, that was not like something I just casually tossed off one day. Well, at least the video was, but the actual chronological timeline and albums and artwork and such and such and such, I'd had that been going on since 2010. So there were obviously things I cut out, as I even mentioned in the video. I have the Red, Blue, and Green album, and I didn't talk about the Green album because I felt that's a greatest hits, and I'm here to talk about the studio albums. But that's what this video is for. This is the part 2 of the last video on the fake Beatle albums that I made. Is what? This is Beatle albums after the breakup, Part 2. Now, I'd like to address that right now what I'm going to talk about is not the studio albums, or at least not the main studio albums. For that, you can go to the Part 1 video right here, which I assume you've at least known existed before you clicked on the Part 2. So, if you haven't seen Part 1, go ahead and look at that, because that's going to essentially give you the main primary focus of this whole study, which is the studio albums. But this video is sort of all the extra side stuff in between. So first I'd like to talk about the singles, or at least the non-album singles that the Beatles would have put out in their alternate timeline. Because, as we all know, while the Beatles' main studio albums are fantastic, tons and tons and tons of highlights got put onto the singles alone because of the Beatles' policy of not putting singles on an album to make the album more worthwhile, which is why there were a lot of highlights of the Beatles' solo careers that don't make it onto the normal studio albums. So that's what we're going to talk about now. What would have happened to the non-album singles? As I started off in my last video, I believe that the alternate Beatles history begins with the Get Back album, which is the Let It Be album officially, but it should have been the Get Back album. Had that album come out the way it was, and then moved towards, well, etc., etc., I say it all in Part 1. Now, the implementation of their solo careers actually starts directly after the Get Back album, specifically with the single of The Ballad of John and Yoko, which in its official released version has a B-side of Old Brown Shoe. Not so in my alternate timeline. The B-side of The Ballad of John and Yoko is the perfect complement to that song, which was also the first real traditional rock song that was released by a Beatle solo, which would have been John Lennon's Give Peace a Chance. In the alternate timeline, this song is attached as the B-side of The Ballad of John and Yoko. And yes, while I'm aware that The Ballad of John and Yoko was written, recorded, and released months before John had written Give Peace a Chance, it just seemed like that was the sort of perfect pairing of a single. to have on the A side the story of John and Yoko's marriage and honeymoon, and on the B side the message that that was supposed to carry. Give peace a chance. So then what happens to Old Brown Shoe? Because that's a good song, and definitely a great George Harrison highlight that gets overlooked. Well, that gets put on to the B-side of the single that comes out after the Something Come Together single, which would be Cold Turkey. John Lennon himself actually stated that he wanted Cold Turkey to be the follow-up to Come Together, or at least wanted it to be the next Beatles single after Abbey Road. And understandably, Paul, George, and Ringo sort of turned it down because the song would have been a very drastic, hard-edged turn after the love you take is equal to the love you make message of Abbey Road. Suddenly you'd have a John Lennon track talking about withdrawing from heroin to finish off the peace and love 60s. But then at the same time, as I mentioned in my last video, that would have been the perfect primer and the perfect steer away from the pristineness of the 60s work that they did into the more minimalist, singer-songwriter, nihilistic edge that they get in their early 70s work with Phil Spector. A few months later, we have the release of Instant Karma. Again, would have been released as a Beatles single. George, I believe, even plays on it, and it would have been the start of the Beatles collaboration with Phil Spector, who produced the track, thus facilitating him coming in during the Beatle album mixes. For the B-side of this single, we have Maybe I'm Amazed, a track that later ends up on the 1970 Beatles album, but is given early release as a highlight here. The next non-album Beatles single would have come after the release of the 1970 Beatles album, early in 1971, which would have been do I want to say this is a double A-side? Nah, I'll say it's a normal A-side. But it would have been the release of It Don't Come Easy, paired with Power to the People as the B-side. This would have been Ringo's debut smash single. Well, I guess his real debut smash single was Yellow Submarine. But this song is infinitely better because It Don't Come Easy is a really interesting song, and certainly Ringo's masterpiece in his solo career, whereas Yellow Submarine makes me want to gouge my ears out. I hate that song. In between the releases of Imagine and Sometime in New York City would have come the single Bangladesh, with its B-side being Back Off Boogaloo. Again, another highlight for Ringo that doesn't make it onto the Sometime in New York City album, which is a fascinating track all on its own. Aside from it being another highlight for Ringo, it also sort of points their direction towards where they're going to end up going with Black Box and Band on the Run. It's got that very glam rock sound, which would have made sense, as according to Ringo, the song was inspired by meetings he'd had with Mark Bolan of T-Rex. This is also really the last time that there will be a non-album B-side highlight on a Beatles single release, because during the 70s the Beatles really start to take on the album as their main focus and really rejecting the idea of the single. So thus this notion that a lot of highlights on singles don't make it onto albums starts to get rejected during this time. The last example of there being a non-album B-side from the Beatles is the single of Whatever Gets You Through the Night, released late in 1974, with its B-side being George's song from Dark Horse, Ding Dong Ding Dong. Now, some would have argued that this should have gone on to Band on the Run along with the Dark Horse song, because then it would have at least given George two vocal highlights. To which I would argue with you, Ding Dong Ding Dong wouldn't have fit in with the rest of the tracks on Band on the Run because it is a New Year's Eve holiday novelty song, and wouldn't have fit in with the rest of the serious pop tracks that exist on Band on the Run. So we got the singles out of the way. Now here's one more thing to talk about, which is live performances. Would the Beatles have gone back out on the road? And the answer is yes, but sparingly. The Beatles' final live performance on top of the roofs of Apple's headquarters in Savile Row on the 30th of January marked the end of the Beatles' live performances, and really supposedly marks the end of the Beatles. But then you had to think, too, that was not what its intention was to be. Paul McCartney wanted the rooftop gig to sort of signal a return of the Beatles going out on the road and doing shows, which is what he felt the future of the Beatles was. Unfortunately, it turned out that the other three vehemently disagreed, particularly John Lennon and George Harrison, both of whom really despised going out live, or at least George Harrison did. He didn't even want to do a live performance with the Get Back project, let alone do multiple gigs with the Beatles out on the road. He didn't like touring, and he had not liked touring since really 1966, which is a trend that he would have even continued on into his solo career. If you look at George Harrison's live performances, they're pretty spare, and we're always sort of gotten mixed reception. There would be highlights, like the concert for Bangladesh and his 1991 tour of Japan, but other than that, his 1974 tour of America was done with him having zero voice, and after that, he pretty much did live gigs really on irregular occasion. He really was not a fan of it. The first real Beatles gig after the rooftop performance would have probably been the Toronto Rock and Roll Festival in 1969. Now, I always debated between whether making it the Lyceum concert that John and Yoko performed with George and people during New Year's or Christmas 1969, or if it should be the Toronto Festival. And I really do believe, after much consideration, it should have been Toronto, purely because John Lennon has stated in interviews that his performance in Toronto with the Plastic Ono Band is the key factor that made him want to leave the Beatles. Because he had returned to live performances, he was working with people who weren't Paul, George, and Ringo, and it showed him that he could do it, and do it successfully, without the other three. We do not want that in our alternate timeline. So instead, when they organized the Toronto Rock and Roll Revival Festival in 1969, the Beatles are asked, and with more forewarning advance notice, so that way Paul, George, and Ringo are able to clear their schedules to do it. That particularly being the main reason why the Beatles didn't perform at that. John Lennon was asked to MC the event, to which he decided to perform anyway, but then, considering how the other three didn't really have time to get a group together, I mean, the festival would have been in 24 hours, they turned and declined on it. So then John ends up doing the performance on his own and decides, hey, this was so much fun, I'm going to leave the Beatles. Instead, the Beatles get forewarning about the Toronto Rock and Roll Revival Festival and decide to play it, which there isn't really evidence of. I know that there was a live piece in Toronto 1969 album, but at the same time, I haven't really collected enough material of Paul live or George live or anyone live during that time to really facilitate there being an album of that. The Beatles do not perform again live on a stage until 1971 during the iconic Concert for Bangladesh, an all-star gathering sort of wrapped together by George Harrison to benefit starving refugees in Bangladesh. This concert pretty much plays out the same exact way it does on George's concert. There's still performances by Billy Preston, Ravi Shankar, Leon Russell, Bob Dylan during the midst of his wilderness years of hiding out from society, which I guess kind of continued today. I don't know, Dylan. We're still searching for you. The difference, though, is that the concert is elongated thanks to additional performances from John and Paul. Well, Ringo already performs in the normal Bangladesh concert, so you don't really need to add him into anything. An album is released of this. I have compiled a live Beatles album of the 70s, and it is made up of selections from the Concert for Bangladesh, plus John Lennon's one-to-one concert released on Live in New York City, and highlights from Wings' tour of America in '76 off of the Wings Over America album. You know what? If anything, listening to this live album gives me the apotheoses of the 60s culture, which is that you get the Beatles backing Bob Dylan on stage at Madison Square Garden in New York in 1971 for a charity concert. You don't get much better than that. That is like just, you want a 60s dream right there? There you go. The Beatles and Dylan on the stage together for a charity concert. It's amazing. Unfortunately, though, while this concert is well received, the album sells well, the film is received well, this does not facilitate the Beatles going back out on the road. George Harrison's reluctance and John Lennon's reluctance to really doing more performances sort of facilitates this, as well as John Lennon's battle against Richard Nixon and the United States government in the mid-70s to obtain a green card to be allowed to stay in America, sort of negates the chances of John really getting the chance to go out and tour a lot. So thus, the Concert for Bangladesh, while being a sort of return to the live stage performances and being a fantastic live show, also ends up being the last concert with the Beatles starring John Lennon. We don't see any live performances for the Beatles until the late 80s, actually, during which they have their comeback with the Cloud 9 album. They finally decide to go out on the road and go out on a massive world tour, which takes them all across the globe, from Europe to America to Japan to the rest of Asia to Africa to Lord knows where. They go on a massive world tour, and this is chronicled on the Beatles Are Live album released in 1993. This is a collection of tracks from Paul is Live album, George's Live in Japan record, and Ringo's Live with the All-Star Band Volume 2, I want to say. I don't know, he's put out a lot of All-Star Band records, and in a really sort of quick succession with each other. I think it's Volume 2. I could be mistaken, though. The tour is massively well received. It's probably the largest show the Beatles ever embark on in their whole career. And as I said before, they really sort of follow up on that by making the anthology TV project and the Free as a Bird album. And again, once again, another death throws a wrench into the mix. George's death in 2001 sort of negates the Beatles' live presence. Paul and Ringo do only one live performance after George's death, which is the Concert for George performance in 2002, at which point they are not even billed as the Beatles, simply as Ringo Starr and Paul McCartney. They arrive as individual guests to this concert, but at the same time it ends up being the first Beatles performance without John or George. The Beatles would not go on tour again until 2009, during which they did a very small summer tour of a few stadiums across America, culminating in the opening of the new Citi Field Stadium on the grounds of Shea Stadium, which facilitates the Good Evening New York City album released in 2009. Made up of selections from Paul's Good Evening New York City album and Ringo Starr Live at the Greek Theater in 2008. The Beatles, as Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr, would end up doing offhand tours during 2011 and 2013 through 15 as just one-off things. They aren't really supporting an album as much as they're just touring because they feel like touring. And now finally we get to the greatest hits albums, namely, what did I do for greatest hits albums? And the answer is exactly the same as the albums that were already released. In 1973, to coincide with the release of Black Box and also to sort of combat the release of bootleg compilations that are being released at around that time, the Beatles put out a 3-album set of greatest hits double albums. Those being 1962 to 1966, aka the Red Album, 1967 to 1969, aka the Blue Album, and 1970 to 1973, aka the Green Album. These albums are pretty much compiled, at least the Red and Blue albums are compiled pretty much the same way as they are on the original releases, as is the Green Album sort of being a selection of hits and non-album singles from the 1970 to 1973 period. Past Masters is the next real official Beatles compilation release. That one is pretty much left as is, except I include the album singles that were put out as well. So Please Please Me single, Can't Buy Me Love, Hard Day's Night, 8 Days a Week, the American single, the Ticket to Ride, Help, and Yesterday releases. Essentially, what Past Masters was in the 80s was just all the songs that didn't make it onto the official Beatles albums when they were put onto CD, so then they just attached them in a 2-disc compilation. I sort of made it in the same way, but essentially making it more of just a singles collection. So, a la the Rolling Stones singles collection that was released a few years later. So essentially you just have all the Beatles singles cataloged from Love Me Do up to, at that time, the Pipes of Peace single, which would have been the last one, since Past Masters comes pre-Cloud 9. And the one album, now extended into a double album thanks to the help of extra #1 singles post-1969. And that is pretty much it for the extra Beatles material other than the studio albums. I guess in retrospect this video is really sort of an extra curio for those who really want to go in depth like me. But then I think the last video sort of was made for people who just want to go in depth like me. So this is a sort of stray ends collection. I may or may not do an album focusing on the Beatles solo albums in our alternate timeline, but at the same time, there's not much I can really say about that. Essentially, just imagine all the songs that don't make it on to the normal studio albums get put onto solo albums that are just recompiled together of all the extra stuff. So, for example, the first John Lennon solo album of the 70s would have been like the Plastic Ono Band album, and it would have had the same artwork and everything, but it would have come out in 72 and had all the extra tracks off of Plastic Ono Band, Imagine, and Sometime in New York City that don't make it onto the official Beatle albums. So if you can just sort of do the math on that one, then that is pretty much where their solo albums end up going. And yeah, this was a shorter video, but then at the same time there wasn't as much to talk about with this one as there was with the last one. I hope you guys enjoy this. I do have more ideas for music discussion vids that I'd like to do, and we'll probably end up doing them. Maybe I can end up getting John and Greg involved on this too. Who knows? Because John and Greg are actually classic rock fans, much like myself. So anyway, guys, that is it, and I will see you next week for another Fan Fiction Drinking Games episode. Take care.